Welcome, engineers. My name's Travis IQ, and today we are starting a series covering CompTIA Security Plus SY0-701 topics. The first topic on the docket is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA Triad. Let's go! Join me in the void as we start this topic discussion. Well, I guess we're not technically in the void because we do have a little image right here, but either way, let's get started. What we're actually doing here is we're applying the concepts of confidentiality, integrity, and availability to data. This little lock and key symbol here is what we're using to reference data. And now we could apply this to other aspects of our infrastructure. We could talk about availability of our underlying services, availability of file sharing, availability of WAN access, availability of a wireless infrastructure. We could talk about these in other contexts, but it really makes a lot of sense, especially as we start discussing the security infrastructure, to apply them to data, because we have very specific technical controls that we can apply to data to maintain confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the first one that I want to talk about is confidentiality. And confidentiality is the concept of making data available only to those who need or should have access to it. Now, how to determine need or necessity of access is a whole nother concept in and of itself, and we'll discuss it another time. But that's what confidentiality is, making sure that that data is only accessible to those who should have access to it. Now, there's a very common mechanism to facilitate that in terms of a technical mechanism, and that's encryption. This is probably one of the first things you think of when you think of making data private or making data only accessible to those individuals who should have access to it. We encrypt the data, and that way the sender has access to it, obviously, because they sent the data or generated it or whatever, and the receiver then has access as well. And so what I'm actually describing to you is not just encryption, but what I described to you there is actually encryption of data in transit. And this brings up another concept, which is states of data. So what can data be doing? Data can be in transit from me to you. Data can be at rest. And data could be in use as well. We don't necessarily always think of data in use, but this is typically data in RAM. This is data in persistent storage. And then I'll say this is data on the wire. And so interestingly enough, we can apply these concepts to the states of that data as well. So we could encrypt the data in transit. Now this will require us to have different encryption mechanisms, because if I'm trying to encrypt data from me to you, then I also need to get an encryption key to you or give you some mechanism to decrypt that data. This isn't required if you think about data in storage or data at rest. This data does not need that same mechanism of data transmission or the same mechanism of transmitting keys or mechanisms to decrypt that data, because I'm storing it and then I'm also the one decrypting it if I were to use a storage key, for example. Now that will change the mechanisms of encryption because the requirements are different, as well as data in use. If I'm encrypting data in use, which is not particularly common, but it can happen, then what I'm saying is I don't want someone looking at that data in use, but also I'm going to be using that data with a high degree of frequency. And so I can't be using a very computationally intense mechanism to encrypt and decrypt data, because that's going to put a large computational load on my underlying infrastructure. So that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense either. So we've defined confidentiality. We've given you a technical mechanism to facilitate confidentiality. And then we've applied that technical mechanism, encryption, to a number of states of data, the three primary states of data. That is just one of these three components of the CIA Triad. The next, I'm kind of going in order of what I think is kind of the easiest mechanisms to describe to the harder mechanisms to describe, but the next principle would be integrity. Integrity describes the data itself. And so what we are saying when data has integrity, we are saying that the data has not changed unless we wanted it to change, and that we can prove that the data has maintained its accuracy or unchangeability over this period of time. Let me give you an example. So if I send a message to you, how do you know that that message is the message that I intended to send to you? And then typically what we would say, there are a number of ways to do this, but what I would say is we can actually ascribe a fingerprint to this. This is called cryptographic hashing. or a cryptographic hash. And so I can then include a cryptographic hash with this message, so when I send it to you, you also have a fingerprint of that message that says, hey, this message has not changed in transit. And now you have both the message and a fingerprint of that message, and you could take a fingerprint of that message as well and compare it to the one I've given to you. There are a number of other problems with this, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about encryption mechanisms and how to apply this more effectively, but that's essentially what this does here. And so we've given you integrity and described a technical mechanism to facilitate or to maintain that integrity, or at minimum to check that integrity has been maintained. We can apply this to data at rest, data in transit, and data in use similarly. Now you could say also, right, that there would be similar issues in terms of whether it was applied in transit or whether it was applied in storage. Is the transit issues oftentimes become more obvious to us, which is how do I get this to you and make sure that someone in between hasn't intercepted and then changed the message and then appended the hash. We'll talk about that at a later date, but those are issues. If you were thinking about them, they are certainly issues that could arise here. Finally, we have availability. Let's just describe this with avail, right? Availability is actually really important. We forget about this at times because we think, oh, I want my messages to be private. I don't want anyone reading them. So that's encryption. I want to make sure that no one changed them in transit. So that's integrity. And transit is one of these easier states of data for us to understand because we're concerned with it. We're concerned with someone stealing our stuff, right? Okay, well, what about availability? Do you think of availability as a security tenant? I just want to be able to have access to my data. Sure, I agree with you. But availability is actually a critical, especially when ascribed to data, is a critical security tenant. Let me give you an example. If it is a critical security tenant, then there must be a mechanism to attack this security component. And in fact, there is. Ransomware is literally attacking the availability of the data. What is it doing? An attacker is gaining access to your system and encrypting your data sets to allow you not to have access to them so that they are no longer available to you. And so availability is actually, it really is necessarily included in this three primary subsets of data security, right? Because it is something that we really do need to maintain. If we do not maintain it, then we have a problem from a business function perspective or from an interpersonal perspective if we need access to that data for whatever reason. Now, when I think about applying availability of data, there's a number of ways to do this. I think a great technical control for maintaining availability of data would be redundancy. And now redundancy itself isn't a technical control, but it is something that I can try to maintain. So a mechanism to maintain redundancy of data would be things like data backups and redundant arrays of drives. So storage that is redundant and therefore resilient to failures or loss of data. So if one of my drives were to fail, if the drives were set up in something like a RAID array, a redundant array of independent disks, then I could actually still maintain access to that data and rebuild that drive so that I could then continue to have a degree of redundancy moving forward in my business. So these are mechanisms to make sure that my data, for example, doesn't just disappear if I were to have a drive die or a server die or something go up in a fire, for example. I can maintain access to that data. It may take me some time in the case of backups or long-term storage backups, but I can still maintain availability of that data, and that's a very important thing. In the next video, we'll go over some multiple choice questions. We'll apply these concepts, answer the questions, I'll give you some additional context, and hopefully you have a little bit more confidence moving forward. As is always the case, I hope you engineer, break stuff, and have fun. We'll see you next time. Let's go.